begins quietly, almost unnoticed from the outside. But for the empath, it feels like a complete inner shift. There comes a moment when reacting no longer feels right, when defending oneself no longer feels necessary, and when explaining the truth to people committed to misunderstanding it starts to feel like self-betrayal. This is the silent phase where everything changes, because the empath is no longer operating from emotional survival mode. Instead of responding to every provocation, every insult, every manipulation, there is a pause, and in that pause something powerful awakens. It is not fear, it is not defeat, and it is not confusion. It is clarity. The empath begins to realize that every reaction has been feeding a cycle. Every emotional outburst was not creating justice. It was feeding energy into a system that thrives on chaos. The more they tried to fix, explain, or fight, the more entangled they became in a dynamic designed to drain them. So the silence is not accidental. It is chosen. It is sacred. It is the first act of true self-respect after years of emotional exhaustion. And in that silence, something unexpected happens. The need to prove becomes weaker, and the need to protect inner peace becomes stronger. This is where the empath starts withdrawing from emotional battles, not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand that not everything deserves their voice. They begin to see that fighting back often keeps them stuck at the same level as the manipulation they are trying to escape. And when that realization settles in deeply, something in them stops engaging with the bait. The provocations are still there, the patterns are still there, but the response is no longer automatic. There is distance now. There is awareness. There is observation instead of participation. To an outside observer, it may look like weakness, like giving up, like surrender. But internally, it is the opposite. It is control being taken back. Because for the first time, the empath is not being pulled into emotional reactions designed by someone else. They are not being dragged into arguments that lead nowhere. They are not trying to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding them. The silence becomes intentional, and that intention carries strength that words never had. In this phase, the empath also begins to understand something deeper about energy. Not everything needs a response to be resolved. Not every injustice needs immediate correction. Some situations collapse on their own when they are no longer fed attention. Yes. And this is where emotional detachment starts becoming a form of protection. The empath learns that silence is not emptiness, it is space. Space for truth to surface without interference. Space for reality to expose what words could never prove. And slowly something else begins to shift. The emotional urgency fades. The need to be seen as right or wrong becomes less important. What matters more is peace, stability, and alignment. The empath is no longer interested in winning emotional battles. They are interested in preserving their energy. They are no longer reacting from wounds, they are responding from awareness. That shift alone changes everything. This is also the point where the narcissistic dynamic starts losing its grip, because it was never sustained by logic or truth, it was sustained by reaction. And when reaction disappears, the system begins to starve. The silence that once seemed like vulnerability now becomes the very thing that disrupts control. There is nothing left to manipulate when there is no emotional response to manipulate. But the most profound part of this stage is internal. The empath no longer feels the same pull toward chaos. Even when provoked, something within them refuses to engage. It is not forced restraint. It is natural disinterest. The emotional hooks no longer land the way they used to. And in that space, a deeper trust begins to form, trust in timing, trust in truth, and trust that they do not need to fight every battle to be protected. So the silence is not empty. It is alive with awareness. It is the beginning of emotional sovereignty. It is the moment the empath stops being a participant in destruction and starts becoming an observer of truth unfolding on its own. There is a stage in the empath's journey where everything they were taught about strength begins to collapse. For so long, strength was associated with reacting quickly, defending oneself, standing one's ground in every argument, and proving innocence in every misunderstanding. But over time, life shows a different truth, one that is far quieter but far more powerful. The real strength is not in how loudly you respond, but in how deeply you can remain centered when provoked. And this is where the empath begins to understand that not fighting back is not weakness, but a form of spiritual intelligence. At first, it feels unnatural. The mind wants to respond, the emotions want to defend, and the wounded parts of the self want justice immediately. But something higher begins to intervene internally. There is a pause before reaction, and in that pause, awareness starts to grow. The empath starts noticing that every time they fight back, they are not really ending the conflict, they are extending it. Every response becomes fuel for another reaction. Every explanation becomes another opportunity for distortion. And slowly, a deeper realization forms. Engaging in the same emotional battlefield does not create freedom, it only deepens entanglement. This is where restraint becomes something sacred. It is no longer about suppressing emotions, it is about choosing not to be controlled by them. The empath begins to see that reacting is often a reflex shaped by pain, while not reacting is a conscious decision shaped by awareness. And that difference changes everything internally. It is no longer about winning or losing an argument. It is about protecting inner peace from unnecessary destruction. There is also a shift in perception. What once felt like disrespect now starts to look like projection. What once triggered anger now starts to reveal patterns. And what once demanded immediate response now feels less urgent. The empath begins to understand that not everything requires participation. Some situations are designed to pull them into emotional exhaustion, and stepping back is not avoidance, it is discernment. In this state, silence becomes more powerful than words. Not because words lose meaning, but because words are no longer needed to validate truth. The empath starts to trust that truth does not collapse just because it is not defended in every moment. There is a quiet confidence that grows inside them, a sense that what is real does not require constant proof, and that confidence slowly replaces the old need to react. This is where spiritual strength begins to reveal itself. It is not loud, it is not aggressive, and it does not seek attention. It is steady, grounded, and unshakable. The empath learns that real power is not in controlling outcomes, but in controlling access to their energy. When they stop feeding every conflict with emotion, something profound happens. They regain ownership of themselves. And in that ownership, fear begins to dissolve. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being misrepresented, fear of being attacked, all of it starts losing influence. Because when there is no longer a need to fight for validation, there is no longer anything to lose in silence. The empath is no longer emotionally dependent on external approval or recognition. Their peace is no longer negotiable. There is also a deeper spiritual layer unfolding. Not fighting back creates space for something greater than human reaction. It creates room for life to respond in ways that emotional impulsivity never could. Situations begin to resolve themselves in unexpected ways, not because the empath forced resolution, but because they stopped interfering with the natural process of consequence. And this is where trust in divine timing begins to replace the urgency of personal justice. Over time, the empath starts to see that their silence is not emptiness, it is protection. It is not surrender, it is elevation. It is a shift from reactive living to conscious being. And in that shift, they begin to detach from the idea that they must constantly defend themselves to be safe or respected. Instead, they realize that alignment, clarity, and inner stability are stronger than any argument they could ever win. This is the moment when strength is redefined, not as resistance, but as restraint. Not as reaction, but as awareness. And not as fighting back, but as rising above the need to fight at all. There comes a point in this dynamic where something shifts in a way that is almost invisible at first, but deeply disruptive underneath. The narcissist, who once relied on emotional reactions as a steady source of control and validation, begins to experience something unfamiliar. The expected responses are no longer coming in the same way. The emotional hooks that used to trigger arguments, exclamations, or emotional collapse no longer produce the same results. And in that absence of reaction, a quiet breakdown begins within the system they once controlled so easily. At the core of this shift is dependency on emotional energy. The entire structure of manipulation, whether subtle or obvious, is built on engagement. It does not matter if the engagement is positive or negative. What matters is the reaction itself. Attention, emotional intensity, and psychological involvement are the fuel. When the empath was reacting, even in pain, the cycle remained alive. But when silence enters, when emotional withdrawal becomes consistent, that fuel source starts disappearing. And what is left behind is not control, but emptiness. At first, this change is misinterpreted. The lack of reaction may be seen as temporary, or as something that can be fixed with more pressure, more provocation, or different tactics. There may be attempts to escalate behavior, to trigger guilt, to provoke jealousy, or to create confusion. But when the empath is no longer emotionally available in the same way, those strategies begin to lose their effectiveness. It is not that the attempts stop, it is that they stop landing the way they used to. This is where the collapse begins slowly, not externally at first, but internally. The narcissist begins to feel a lack of control over the emotional environment they once dominated. Situations that once felt predictable become uncertain. Reactions that were once guaranteed become inconsistent or absent altogether. And that unpredictability creates frustration, then confusion, and eventually instability in their own behavior patterns. What makes this even more impactful is that silence cannot be argued with. Emotional withdrawal cannot be manipulated in the same way that emotional reaction can. There is nothing to twist, nothing to escalate in the same predictable direction. The absence of engagement becomes a mirror, reflecting back the lack of control without needing any confrontation. And this reflection is uncomfortable because it cannot be redirected or disguised as easily as emotional conflict can be. As time continues, something deeper begins to happen. The narcissist is forced to face their own emotional state without external regulation. The constant feedback loop they relied on is no longer stabilizing their inner world. Without consistent reactions from the empath, their sense of control begins to weaken. And in that weakening, their strategies either intensify in desperation or begin to fall apart altogether. Meanwhile, the empath remains detached, not engaged in emotional warfare, not feeding into cycles of provocation, and not participating in the push and pull dynamics that once defined the relationship. This detachment is not emotional numbness, it is clarity. It is the recognition that involvement in manipulation does not lead to resolution, only repetition. In the end, once that is understood, participation naturally declines. This is where the imbalance becomes undeniable. One side is no longer emotionally accessible, while the other is still attempting to access what is no longer available. The structure that once depended on mutual engagement becomes one-sided. And in that imbalance, instability grows. What was once controlled interaction becomes unpredictable tension. There is also a psychological consequence that cannot be ignored. When emotional control stops working, it creates a loss of influence. And when influence is lost, the illusion of dominance begins to fade. The narcissist may still attempt to regain it through different means, but without emotional response, those attempts lose their foundation. There is nothing stable to hold on to anymore. At a deeper level, what is actually happening is not just a change in behavior, but a collapse of dependency. The empath is no longer participating in a system that required their emotional availability to function. And without that participation, the system starts to break down naturally, without force, without confrontation, and without direct resistance. This is why silence becomes so powerful. It does not attack, it does not argue, it does not compete. It simply removes the essential ingredient that kept the dynamic alive. And when that ingredient is gone, everything built on it begins to weaken on its own. There is a moment in the empath's journey where the idea of justice stops looking like something they have, to create with their own hands, and starts revealing itself as something far greater than personal effort. For a long time, the wounded self believes that justice means confrontation, exposure, or emotional correction. It feels like if they do not speak, defend, or prove what happened, then nothing will balance out. But over time, life begins to show a different structure at work, one that does not rely on constant human intervention to correct imbalance. This is where the understanding of divine justice begins to quietly replace emotional retaliation. It does not mean the empath suddenly stops caring about truth or fairness. It means they stop believing that their emotional reaction is required for truth to exist. There is a shift from urgency to trust, from force to observation, and from control to surrender. And in that shift, something profound opens up internally. The empath starts to notice that consequences have their own timing. What is hidden does not remain hidden forever. What is misused eventually creates imbalance for the one misusing it. What is projected onto others eventually returns to its source in ways that are not always immediate, but are often precise. And this realization slowly reduces the need to intervene in every situation emotionally. This is not about wishing harm or expecting punishment. It is about recognizing that life itself contains a balancing mechanism that does not depend on personal revenge. When someone operates through manipulation, control, or emotional exploitation, they are not just affecting others, they are also shaping their own trajectory. And over time, those patterns begin to generate outcomes that match the energy behind them. For the empath, this understanding brings relief, but not in a superficial way. It is not relief from anger alone, but relief from responsibility that was never theirs to carry in the first place. The constant pressure to fix, explain, or expose begins to fade because it becomes clear that truth does not need to be forced. It reveals itself through unfolding consequences that are often far more accurate than immediate reactions. There is also a deep internal transformation happening alongside this awareness. The empath begins to release the emotional attachment to seeing justice happen in a specific form or time frame. They stop measuring fairness by how quickly someone is held accountable. Instead, they begin to understand that timing is not controlled by human emotion, but by a larger order that unfolds beyond immediate perception. In this space, silence takes on a different meaning. It is no longer avoidance or suppression. It becomes participation in a higher process of unfolding truth. The empath is no longer interfering with outcomes through emotional reactivity. They are allowing space for clarity to emerge naturally, without distortion from fear, anger, or urgency. And while nothing may appear to be happening on the surface, something is always shifting beneath it. Patterns that were once hidden begin to surface in subtle ways. Relationships built on manipulation begin to weaken under the weight of their own imbalance. Actions that once seemed unnoticed begin to carry consequences that cannot be avoided forever, not because someone is actively enforcing them, but because imbalance cannot sustain itself indefinitely. This understanding also changes the empath's relationship with pain. Instead of seeing pain as something that must immediately be corrected through confrontation, they begin to see it as information, as part of a larger unfolding process. Pain becomes less of a command to act and more of a signal to observe. And in that observation, emotional reactivity slowly loses its grip. There is a quiet strength that develops from this awareness. The empath no longer feels the need to chase resolution in every situation. They no longer believe that silence equals injustice or that absence of reaction means absence of truth. Instead, they begin to trust that truth has its own momentum and that what is real will eventually reveal itself without force. This does not remove the complexity of human experience. It does not erase the emotional impact of what has been endured. But it does shift the center of power. Instead of carrying the burden of enforcement, the empath begins to step back and allow life to complete what emotional struggle could never fully resolve. And in that step back, something stabilizes. The inner world becomes less chaotic, less reactive, and more grounded in observation. The need to control outcomes fades, and in its place grows a deeper acceptance that justice is not always immediate, but it is always active in ways that are not always visible at first. This is where divine justice is no longer an idea, it becomes an experience of trust in the unfolding of life itself. There is a transformation that happens in the empath when they begin to reclaim their energy after long periods of emotional depletion. It is not loud, and it is not dramatic, but it is undeniable. The way they respond to people, situations, and emotional pressure begins to change. What once felt automatic explaining, fixing, overgiving, or emotionally engaging starts to slow down. There is a new awareness forming, and with it comes a natural boundary that does not need to be spoken out loud to be felt by others. This shift is not about building walls or becoming cold in the emotional sense. It is about energy awareness. The empath starts to realize that their emotional availability has value, and not every situation deserves access to it. For a long time, their openness was used as a space where others could project, unload, or manipulate emotions. But now that awareness has developed, that same openness begins to be filtered through discernment, and this is where manipulation starts to lose its entry points. It is not that manipulation disappears from the outside world, it is that it no longer finds the same access within the empath. The emotional hooks that once worked guilt, confusion, nostalgia, urgency no longer land in the same way. There is a pause before response, and in that pause, clarity begins to rise. Instead of reacting from emotional impulse, the empath begins to observe the intention behind the interaction. This change creates something powerful: emotional immunity. Not in the sense of being disconnected from feelings, but in the sense of no longer being controlled by them. The empath can still feel deeply, but they are no longer easily pulled into emotional chaos that drains or distorts their inner state. They begin to distinguish between genuine connection and emotional manipulation disguised as connection. As this awareness strengthens, their presence itself begins to shift. They become less available in ways that once felt habitual. They do not over-explain themselves anymore. They do not rush to repair misunderstandings that are intentionally created. They do not chase clarity in spaces designed to confuse them. And this restraint changes the entire dynamic around them. For those used to emotional access, this change feels like distance. But internally, it is alignment. The empath is no longer leaking energy into situations that offer no stability in return. Instead, they begin to conserve their emotional presence for what is reciprocal, grounded, and real. And this conservation of energy is where true protection begins. Over time, manipulation loses its grip not because it becomes less present, but because it becomes less effective. When emotional reactions are no longer available on demand, the entire structure that depended on those reactions begins to weaken. Attempts to provoke, confuse, or destabilize do not generate the same response they once did. There is still awareness from the empath, but there is no emotional entanglement attached to that awareness. This is also where the empath begins to understand the difference between reaction and response. The reaction is immediate, emotional, and often draining. Response is measured, conscious, and aligned with inner stability. And once this difference becomes clear, the empath naturally shifts toward response rather than reaction in almost every situation. That shift alone changes the entire emotional landscape they operate within. There is also a subtle but profound sense of reclaiming selfhood. The empath starts to recognize moments where they were previously pulled into emotional roles that were not truly theirs to carry. Roles of fixer, absorber, explainer, or emotional stabilizer for others. And instead of continuing those patterns, they begin to step out of them. Not with resistance, but with quiet withdrawal. As this continues, emotional manipulation begins to feel less like something threatening and more like something recognizable. It loses its illusion. The patterns become visible before they fully take effect. And with that visibility comes the choice not to engage, not to absorb, and not to participate in dynamics that compromise inner peace. This is where emotional sovereignty begins to take root. The empath is no longer defined by how others attempt to interact with them emotionally. They are defined by how they choose to respond to those interactions. And in that choice, power is no longer external, it becomes internal and stable. The most important part of this transformation is that it does not require aggression. It does not require confrontation or proving anything to anyone. It is simply a consistent return to self-awareness, a return to emotional boundaries that are felt, not enforced. And in that quiet consistency, manipulation loses its direction because it no longer finds a reactive surface to attach itself to. And what remains is clarity, a calm, steady awareness that protects without effort and preserves peace without struggle. There is a point in the empath's journey where silence stops being something forced and starts becoming something natural. It is no longer a reaction to pain, nor a strategy to avoid conflict. It becomes a state of being. In this state, the empath no longer feels the need to constantly explain themselves, defend their intentions, or correct every misunderstanding that others project onto them. The energy that once went into emotional engagement is now directed inward, into stability, awareness, and peace. And from the outside, this change is often misunderstood, but from the inside, it feels like returning home. Silence in this stage carries a different kind of weight. It is no longer empty. It is full of awareness. It is not absence of response, but presence of clarity. The empath is fully aware of what is happening around them, but they are no longer emotionally entangled in it. They can see patterns without being pulled into them. They can recognize manipulation without being drawn into confrontation. And they can observe chaos without becoming part of it. This is where silence becomes the loudest answer. Not because it is meant to send a message, but because it reveals truth without interference. When emotional reactions are removed from a dynamic that once depended on them, the underlying structure begins to show itself more clearly. What was hidden behind intensity, arguments, or emotional noise becomes more visible in stillness. And that visibility often speaks louder than any words ever could. For the empath, this silence is not about punishment or withdrawal from life. It is about preservation. It is about protecting inner space from being repeatedly invaded by cycles that lead nowhere. There is a deep understanding that not every situation requires participation, and not every person deserves access to emotional energy. And once that understanding is fully embodied, silence becomes a natural boundary that does not need to be enforced through effort. In this state, the empath is no longer trying to win emotional battles. The need to be right, to be understood, or to be validated externally loses its grip. It becomes more important is alignment with inner peace, and that alignment cannot coexist with constant emotional reactivity. So instead of engaging in cycles that drain clarity, the empath chooses stillness. Not because they are defeated, but because they are no longer interested in distortion. This silence also changes how truth unfolds. Without emotional interference, situations begin to reveal themselves in their own time. Misunderstandings lose their power to create confusion because there is no longer emotional participation feeding them. Manipulative dynamics begin to lose structure because they depend on engagement to sustain themselves. And in the absence of that engagement, what remains is often clarity that cannot be denied. There is a quiet strength in this form of detachment. It does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. It simply exists as stability in the presence of instability. And that stability becomes the empath's protection. Not because they are fighting against anything, but because they are no longer feeding what once drained them. Over time, this silence becomes transformative. It changes the way the empath relates to everything, people, situations, even their own emotions. Instead of reacting immediately, there is space. Instead of being pulled outward by emotional intensity, there is grounding inward. And in that space, choices become clearer, responses become more intentional, and energy is no longer scattered into unnecessary conflict. This is also where the illusion of control held by others begins to fade. When emotional reactions are no longer available as leverage, control loses its foundation. There is nothing predictable to manipulate, nothing reactive to depend on. And in that absence, the dynamic shifts completely. What once felt like influence turns into uncertainty for those who relied on emotional engagement. But for the empath, this is not a victory to celebrate externally. It is a realization to integrate internally. The real shift is not in how others behave, but in how they no longer need to participate in cycles that harm their peace. Silence becomes a boundary that protects without confrontation, preserves without explanation, and stabilizes without effort. And in that silence, something deeper becomes clear. Truth does not need constant defense to exist. It does not need emotional energy to remain valid. It simply unfolds, reveals, and settles in its own time. The empath no longer stands in the middle of emotional storms trying to control their direction. They stand outside of it, aware, grounded, and unshaken. This is why silence becomes the final turning point. It is where reaction ends, awareness begins, and truth is allowed to speak without interruption.